At 73 years old, I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. I'd buried my husband of 47 years, watched friends pass away, and survived the quiet ache of watching my children grow up and move away. But nothing prepared me for the kind of betrayal that would unfold on Christmas Eve, when I discovered that the 3 children I devoted my life to raising had coordinated their excuses to avoid spending the holidays with me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What started as a simple phone call, checking on dinner preparations, would reveal a web of lies that shattered everything I believed about family loyalty. My response at midnight that Christmas Eve would change everything, and by New Year's Day my children would learn that some actions have consequences that last a lifetime. My name is Liza Henderson, and for the past 5 years since losing my husband Frank, I've been living alone in our family home on Elm Street in Maple Ridge, Ohio. It's a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters that Frank painted every 3 years, like clockwork, and a wraparound porch where we used to sit on summer evenings watching the neighborhood children play. The house holds 47 years of memories, from the day Frank carried me over the threshold as newlyweds, to the morning I kissed him goodbye before the ambulance took him away for the last time. People in town know me as the woman who ran the elementary school library for 32 years, who organized the annual Christmas pageant, and who never missed a single one of my children's school events. I taught Sunday school, volunteered at the food bank, and kept a guest room ready for whenever my children wanted to visit. Frank used to joke that I could stretch a pot roast to feed half the neighborhood, and he wasn't wrong. Our dinner table had always been the gathering place for family celebrations, homework sessions, and heart-to-heart conversations that lasted long into the night. After Frank's funeral, I threw myself into maintaining the traditions that had always defined our family. I continued hosting Sunday dinners, sent care packages to my children, and called each of them twice a week to stay connected to their busy lives. Christmas had always been our biggest celebration, and in the years since Frank's death, it had become even more important to me. It represented continuity, the promise that some things would remain constant even as everything else changed. This particular December started like any other. I'd begun my Christmas preparations right after Thanksgiving, just as I had for decades. The artificial tree Frank and I had bought in 1987 went up in its usual spot by the front window, decorated with ornaments that told the story of our family's journey. There were the handmade construction paper angels my children had crafted in elementary school, their fingerprints still visible in the glitter and glue. The delicate glass baubles Frank had given me for our first Christmas as married couple held places of honor near the top, catching the morning light that streamed through the lace curtains. I'd already purchased gifts for everyone, wrapping them carefully and arranging them under the tree with the same attention to detail I'd always brought to Christmas morning. For Robert, my eldest at 45, I'd found a first edition of a book about World War II aircraft, knowing his passion for military history. Sarah, my only daughter at 42, would receive the antique jewelry box I'd been saving for her, along with the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. Michael, the baby of the family at 39, was getting a set of professional cooking knives to support his hobby of gourmet cooking, something he'd developed during the pandemic. The grandchildren's gifts required more consideration, since they seemed to outgrow their interests as quickly as they outgrew their clothes. Tyler, Robert's 16-year-old son, was deep into his guitar phase, so I'd managed to find vintage music books and a leather strap for his instrument. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. His younger sister Chloe, 13 and horse crazy, was getting riding lessons at the stable outside town, something I'd arranged months in advance. Jessica, Sarah's 15-year-old daughter, had been asking for art supplies, so I'd assembled a collection of professional-grade materials that would support her growing talent for painting. December 15th was when I made my annual call to confirm Christmas dinner plans. Over the years, this had become a cherished ritual, the moment when the holiday officially began in my mind. I'd pull out my recipe cards, plan the menu, and start the elaborate preparation that turned our Christmas feast into something magical. Frank used to say that Christmas dinner at our house was better than anything you could get at the finest restaurants, and I'd always taken pride in maintaining that standard even after he was gone. I decided to call Robert first, since as the eldest, he'd often taken the unofficial role of family coordinator in recent years. His phone rang several times before he picked up, and I could hear the sounds of his busy household in the background. Emma was calling something to one of the kids, and there was the constant hum of activity that characterized their life in the suburbs of Columbus. "Hi, Mom," Robert said, and I immediately detected something different in his tone. Usually, he greeted me with warmth and genuine pleasure at hearing my voice. This time, there was a tension, a hesitation that made me sit up straighter in my kitchen chair. "Hello, sweetheart," I replied, settling into what I expected would be our usual conversation about travel times, side dishes, and whether the kids had grown since I'd last seen them. "I was calling to finalize our Christmas plans. Should I expect you around noon like usual, or would you prefer to come earlier this year?" The pause that followed stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. When Robert finally spoke, his words hit me like cold water. "Mom, about Christmas. Emma and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we stayed home this year. You know how crazy the holidays get with the kids' schedules? And Emma's parents are getting older. We thought we should spend Christmas with them." I felt my chest tighten, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "Of course, I understand. Family is important." The irony of those words wasn't lost on me, even in the moment. "But surely you could come for Christmas Eve dinner, or maybe the day after Christmas? We could be flexible with the timing." "That's just it, Mom. The whole week is pretty packed. Tyler has basketball practice, Chloe has a riding competition, and Emma's mom specifically asked if we could do Christmas morning with them. It would mean a lot to her, especially since her husband hasn't been feeling well." The explanation sounded reasonable, even considerate, but something about the way Robert delivered it felt rehearsed. In 30 years of his adult life, I'd heard him navigate difficult conversations with clients, negotiate business deals, and handle family scheduling conflicts. This didn't sound like natural problem solving. This sounded like someone delivering a prepared statement. "I see," I managed, though I really didn't see it all. "Well, I'm disappointed, but I suppose these things happen. What about New Year's? Could we plan something then?" "We'll have to see how things go," Robert said, his tone growing more distant. "You know how it is after the holidays. Everyone's trying to get back into their routines. The kids have school starting up again, and I've got that big project at work that's been consuming all my time." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. In 45 years of being Robert's mother, he had never canceled Christmas. Even during his college years, when money was tight and travel was difficult, he'd found a way to come home. Even the year Emma had the flu and could barely get out of bed, they'd made the trip to Maple Ridge. Christmas at Mom's house had been as inevitable as Christmas itself. I decided to call Sarah next, hoping that my daughter would bring better news. Sarah had always been the most sentimental of my children, the one who remembered birthdays without being reminded and who called just to chat about ordinary things. If anyone would understand how important Christmas together was to me, it would be Sarah. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual given her demanding schedule as a real estate agent. Sarah had built a successful career selling homes in the upscale suburbs of Cincinnati, and December was often one of her busiest months as people tried to close deals before the end of the year. I left a message asking her to call me back when she had a chance, mentioning that I wanted to discuss Christmas plans. When she returned my call 2 hours later, I was in the middle of addressing Christmas cards, a task that had become more poignant in recent years, as the list grew shorter with each passing season. The sound of her voice brought immediate comfort, the familiar warmth of my only daughter checking in with her mother. "Hi, Mom. Sorry I missed your call earlier. I was showing a property to clients who are relocating from Chicago. What's going on with Christmas plans? Please tell me you're not trying to cook for 20 people again like you did that one year when Aunt Martha brought her entire family." Her light, teasing tone made me smile despite the lingering unease from my conversation with Robert. "No, sweetheart, just the usual crowd. But actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Robert just called and said they won't be able to make it this year. Something about Emma's parents and the kids' activities. I was hoping you and David and Jessica could still come, even if it's just the 4 of us." The pause that followed was briefer than Robert's had been, but it carried the same ominous weight. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had lost its playful quality and taken on the careful tone she used with difficult clients. "Oh, Mom, this is terrible timing." David just told me yesterday that his sister invited us to spend Christmas at their ski lodge in Colorado. It's been years since we've seen his family, and Jessica is so excited about learning to ski. We already bought the plane tickets and everything. The explanation felt like a physical blow. Sarah's relationship with David's sister had always been strained, something Sarah had complained about for years. The idea that she would choose to spend Christmas with someone she'd described as pretentious and competitive over Christmas with her own mother seemed impossible to believe. "Since when do you ski?" I asked, unable to keep the confusion out of my voice. "You've always said you preferred warm weather vacations." "People change, Mom." We thought it would be good for Jessica to try new things, and David's been working so hard lately. He deserves a real vacation, not just sitting around eating turkey and watching football. The dismissive way she characterized our Christmas traditions stung more than I wanted to admit. Sitting around eating turkey and watching football had been the foundation of some of our family's most treasured memories. It was the backdrop for engagement announcements, pregnancy reveals, and countless conversations that had strengthened our bonds as a family. "I understand," I said, though once again I really didn't. "I hope you have a wonderful time in Colorado. Maybe we can plan something for when you get back." "Definitely, Mom. We'll definitely plan something soon. I have to run now, but I'll call you on Christmas Day, okay? Love you." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the growing realization that Christmas was falling apart in ways I'd never anticipated. 2 down, 1 to go. Surely Michael, my youngest, would come through. Michael had always been the most family-oriented of my children, the one who remembered every anniversary, and who still called me on the anniversary of his father's death to check on how I was doing. Michael's phone rang only twice before he picked up, and his voice carried the easy warmth that had always made him my most emotionally available child. As a chef at a trendy restaurant in Cleveland, he worked unconventional hours, but he'd always made time for family obligations. "Hey Mom, perfect timing. I just finished prep for tonight's service. How are you doing? Are you ready for Christmas? Do you need me to bring anything special this year?" The normalcy of his response brought such relief that I felt tears prick my eyes. Here was my son, asking what he could contribute, thinking about my needs, approaching Christmas with the enthusiasm that had been missing from my conversations with his siblings. "Oh, Michael, I'm so glad to hear your voice. I've had the strangest day." Robert and Sarah both called to cancel Christmas, and I was starting to worry that something was going on that I didn't know about. The silence that followed was different from the pauses in my earlier conversations. This wasn't the silence of someone searching for the right words to deliver bad news. This was the silence of someone who had been caught off guard, who was processing unexpected information. "They both canceled?" Michael asked, and I could hear genuine surprise in his voice. "That's weird. I mean, I know everyone's been busy, but Christmas? They both canceled Christmas?" Robert said Emma's parents needed them, and Sarah said David's family invited them to Colorado for skiing. I know these things happen, but it does seem like an unusual coincidence that they'd both have conflicts in the same year. Michael was quiet for another moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a thoughtful quality that I recognized from his childhood. Michael had always been the family problem solver, the one who noticed when something wasn't quite right and worked to fix it. "Mom, I want you to know that I absolutely planned to be there for Christmas. I already requested the time off, and I've been looking forward to it for weeks. But now I'm wondering if maybe we should try to figure out what's really going on with Robert and Sarah. It's not like them to just bail on Christmas without a better reason." The relief I felt was overwhelming. Not only was Michael planning to come home, but he shared my sense that something unusual was happening. "So you think their excuses seemed strange too?" "Honestly, yeah, I do. Emma's parents live 20 minutes away from Robert. They could easily do Christmas Eve with her family and Christmas Day with you. And Sarah hates skiing. Remember that trip to Vermont when we were kids? She spent the entire time in the lodge, drinking hot chocolate and complaining about the cold." His observation confirmed what I'd been thinking but hadn't wanted to voice. These weren't legitimate scheduling conflicts. These were excuses, and not particularly good ones. "But why would they lie to me about Christmas?" I asked, voicing the question that had been growing in my mind since Robert's call. If they don't want to come home, why not just say so? I'm not going to force anyone to spend Christmas with me. I don't know, Mom, but I intend to find out. Give me a day or two to make some calls, okay? And don't worry about Christmas. Even if it's just you and me, we'll make it special. I've been working on this amazing recipe for duck confit that I've been dying to try on someone who appreciates good food. After we hung up, I felt marginally better, but deeply unsettled. Michael's reassurance that he would be there provided some comfort, but it didn't address the larger questions his observations had raised. Why would Robert and Sarah lie about their reasons for missing Christmas? What could possibly motivate them to coordinate their excuses and abandon the family tradition that had anchored our lives for decades? I spent the rest of the evening trying to distract myself with normal activities. I finished addressing Christmas cards, updated my shopping list, and called my neighbor Linda to confirm our plans to attend the Christmas Eve service at church together. But underneath these routine tasks, my mind kept returning to the conversations with my children, analyzing their words, their tone, their explanations that didn't quite make sense. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Frank and I had bought this house when Robert was just a toddler, and every room held memories of the life we'd built together. The master bedroom had been our sanctuary, the place where we'd talked through parenting challenges, celebrated small victories, and comforted each other through difficult times. After Frank's death, I'd considered selling the house and moving to something smaller, more manageable. But the idea of leaving all these memories behind felt like losing Frank all over again. Besides, where would the children come for Christmas if I didn't have the family home to welcome them? Now, for the first time, I was wondering if maintaining this house for family gatherings was worth the effort if my family no longer wanted to gather. The next morning brought Michael's promised phone call, but his voice carried news that would change everything I thought I knew about my children and their feelings toward me. Mom, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it. I called Robert last night to ask him what was really going on with Christmas. At first, he tried to stick to his story about Emma's parents, but when I pressed him, he finally told me the truth. I gripped the phone tighter, steeling myself for whatever revelation was coming. What did he say? He said that he, Sarah, and their spouses have been talking for months about how to handle Christmas this year. Apparently, they all feel like coming home for the holidays has become more of an obligation than something they want to do. They think you're too demanding, too focused on maintaining traditions that don't mean as much to them as they do to you. The words hit me like physical blows. Too demanding? Too focused on traditions? These were the traditions that had given our family its foundation, that had created the memories my children claimed to cherish. There's more, Michael continued, his voice gentle but determined to tell me everything. They said they feel guilty about not wanting to come home, but they also feel like you put too much pressure on them to participate in family events. Sarah told Robert that she feels like she can never live up to your expectations, and Robert said that Emma has been complaining for years about how she feels judged when they visit. I sank into Frank's old recliner, struggling to process what I was hearing. Emma felt judged? I'd always gone out of my way to make her feel welcome, to include her in family traditions, to treat her like the daughter I'd never had beyond Sarah. But Michael, why didn't they just talk to me? If they were unhappy with something, why not have a conversation instead of lying and sneaking around behind my back? That's exactly what I asked Robert. He said they were afraid of hurting your feelings, and they thought it would be easier to just gradually reduce their visits until you got used to spending holidays differently. The calculated nature of their plan was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or a response to this year's particular circumstances. This was a coordinated strategy to phase me out of their lives gradually, hoping I wouldn't notice or would simply accept it as the natural order of things. So they all agreed to this? All of them decided that Christmas with me wasn't worth their time? Robert and Sarah did. I told him exactly what I thought of their plan, and I told him that if they wanted to abandon you during the holidays, they could explain it to their children someday. But Mom, I need you to know that I had no part in this. I think what they're doing is horrible, and I told Robert so. The loyalty in Michael's voice provided some comfort, But it couldn't erase the devastation of learning that 2 of my 3 children had secretly decided I was more burden than blessing in their lives. After Michael and I hung up, I sat in Frank's chair for a long time, staring at the Christmas tree with its carefully arranged ornaments and thoughtfully wrapped gifts. Every decoration told a story of family love. Every present represented hours of consideration about what would bring joy to the people I'd devoted my life to caring for. But, apparently, that care had become a burden. My expectations had become too demanding. My traditions had become obligations rather than celebrations. The more I thought about Robert and Sarah's decision, the angrier I became. It wasn't just the lying, though that was painful enough. It was the assumption that I was too fragile, or too demanding, to handle an honest conversation about their feelings. It was the presumption that they could make decisions about my life without including me in the discussion. I'd spent 47 years as Frank's wife and partner, facing challenges together, making difficult decisions as a team. I'd raised 3 children, managed a household, worked full-time, and navigated all the complexities of adult life. The idea that my own children thought I couldn't handle a straightforward conversation about holiday plans was insulting in ways that went beyond the immediate hurt of their rejection. By evening, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. If Robert and Sarah wanted to be released from their obligations to their mother, if they felt burdened by my expectations and traditions, then I would grant them exactly what they seemed to want. I called my attorney, Mr. Patterson, at his home number. Harold Patterson had been Frank's friend since college and had handled our family's legal affairs for decades. He'd written our wills, handled the house purchase, and guided me through the legal complexities following Frank's death. "Harold, I need to schedule an appointment to revise my will. Something has come up that requires immediate attention." "Of course, Liza. Is everything all right? It's unusual for you to call about legal matters on such short notice." Let's just say that Christmas has brought some unexpected clarity about my family situation. Could we meet tomorrow afternoon? I'd like to make some significant changes before the holidays. Certainly. Should I ask what kind of changes you're considering? The kind that will ensure my children understand the consequences of their choices. I'll explain everything when I see you tomorrow. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of agency, of taking control over a situation that had been imposed upon me without my consent. For too long, I'd been the passive recipient of my children's decisions about our relationship. Tomorrow, I would begin making some decisions of my own. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit Frank had always said made me look distinguished, choosing my grandmother's pearl earrings and the gold wedding band I still wore 5 years after becoming a widow. If I was going to take control of my family's future, I wanted to look like someone whose decisions commanded respect. Harold Patterson's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, with tall windows that overlooked Maple Ridge's modest Main Street. I'd been there countless times over the years, always accompanied by Frank as we made decisions together about our family's security and future. Walking up those familiar stairs alone felt like crossing a threshold into a different phase of my life, one where I would make choices based on my own judgment, rather than the collective needs of a family that apparently no longer valued my participation. Harold greeted me with the same gentle warmth he'd shown since Frank's funeral, but I could see concern in his weathered face as he guided me to the leather chairs near his desk. At 78, Harold had been practicing law for over 50 years, and he developed an instinct for reading the emotional undercurrents that brought people to his office. "Liza, you sounded quite determined on the phone yesterday. Before we discuss any changes to your will, why don't you tell me what's prompted this sudden urgency?" "In all the years I've known you, you've never made important legal decisions impulsively." I appreciated his directness. Harold had always treated me as an intelligent adult, capable of making my own choices, unlike my children, who seemed to view me as someone whose feelings needed to be managed rather than respected. "Harold, yesterday I discovered that Robert and Sarah have been planning for months to avoid spending Christmas with me. They didn't have the courtesy to discuss their feelings honestly. Instead, they coordinated elaborate lies to make me believe they had legitimate conflicts. According to Michael, they think I'm too demanding, and that family traditions have become burdens rather than celebrations. Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious as I continued. The will Frank and I created left everything divided equally among the 3 children. At the time, that seemed fair and natural. But Frank and I wrote that will assuming our children valued their relationship with us, that they would want to maintain the family bonds we'd worked so hard to create. And now you're questioning those assumptions? I'm questioning whether children who find spending Christmas with their mother too burdensome deserve to inherit the house where those Christmas celebrations took place. I'm questioning whether people who can't be honest with me about their feelings should benefit from a lifetime of my honesty and devotion to them. Harold was taking notes, but his eyes remained focused on my face, reading the determination there. What specific changes are you considering? I pulled a handwritten list from my purse, the result of a sleepless night spent thinking through the implications of my decision. I want to remove Robert and Sarah as beneficiaries of my estate. The house, the investments Frank and I accumulated, the family heirlooms that have been passed down through generations, I want all of it to go to Michael. He's the only one of my children who still values family relationships enough to be honest with me. That's a significant change, Liza. Have you considered the long-term impact this might have on your family relationships? Once you disinherit someone, it's very difficult to repair that breach, even if circumstances change. Harold, they've already breached our relationship. They just didn't have the courage to tell me directly. I'm simply acknowledging the reality they've created and responding accordingly. Harold set down his pen and leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. I've been practicing family law for 5 decades, and I've seen situations like this destroy families permanently. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand all your options. Have you considered talking to Robert and Sarah directly about your feelings? Sometimes these conflicts arise from misunderstandings that can be resolved through honest communication. His suggestion sparked a flash of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Honest communication? Harold, they spent months planning to lie to me about Christmas. They discussed my supposed shortcomings as a mother with their spouses, decided I was too demanding, and then created elaborate deceptions to avoid dealing with me directly. What part of that suggests they're interested in honest communication? You raise a valid point. But consider this. If you change your will now, while you're angry and hurt, you might regret it later when your emotions have settled. What if they come to understand how their actions affected you? What if they want to make amends? I thought about his question seriously, trying to imagine a scenario where Robert and Sarah would genuinely apologize for their deception and work to rebuild our relationship. But even in my most optimistic moments, I couldn't envision them taking responsibility for the pain they'd caused, or making meaningful changes to their behavior. Harold, I'm 73 years old, Frank is gone, my health is good but not guaranteed, and I may not have many more years to see how this situation plays out. If Robert and Sarah want to treat me like an obligation rather than their mother, then I'll spare them the burden of inheriting from someone they find so difficult to deal with. What about their children? Your grandchildren? They would also be affected by these changes. That question gave me pause. Tyler, Chloe, and Jessica had done nothing wrong, and the idea of punishing them for their parents' choices troubled me. But as I thought about it more deeply, I realized that Robert and Sarah's behavior was teaching their children lessons about family loyalty that I found deeply disturbing. Harold, what kind of message does it send to Tyler, Chloe, and Jessica when their parents lie to their grandmother about Christmas? What are they learning about respect for elders, about honesty in family relationships, about the value of maintaining traditions that connect us across generations? I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the quiet street where a few shoppers were carrying Christmas packages between the local stores. If I leave my estate to Robert and Sarah, I'm essentially rewarding them for treating me poorly. I'm telling their children that it doesn't matter how you treat your parents, you'll still inherit everything they worked for. And if you disinherit them, then I'm teaching those grandchildren that actions have consequences, that family relationships require effort and honesty from everyone involved. Maybe that's a more valuable lesson than any inheritance could provide. Harold was quiet for several minutes, reviewing his notes and considering my arguments. Finally, he looked up with the expression of someone who had reached a difficult decision. Liza, I've known you for 30 years, and I've never seen you make a decision based on spite or temporary anger. If you're certain this is what you want, I'll prepare the paperwork. But I want to suggest a modification that might serve your purposes while leaving some room for reconciliation. What kind of modification? Instead of permanently disinheriting Robert and Sarah, what if we create a conditional inheritance? They could inherit their portions of the estate, but only if they meet certain requirements that demonstrate genuine commitment to rebuilding their relationship with you. The idea was intriguing, though I wasn't sure what those conditions might look like. What kind of requirements are you thinking about? Well, that would be up to you, but you could require them to spend a certain number of holidays with you each year, or to call you regularly, or to participate in family counseling to address the issues that led to this crisis. The point would be to give them a path back to your good graces, but only if they're willing to do the work required. I considered Harold's suggestion carefully. It had a certain appeal, offering the possibility of redemption, while still making clear that their behavior had consequences. But it also felt like I would be trying to force relationships that they'd already decided they didn't want. Harold, if I have to create legal requirements to get my children to spend time with me, what does that say about the quality of our relationship? Do I really want Christmas visits that happen because they're required for inheritance rather than because they genuinely want to be there? That's a fair point. But consider this. Sometimes people need external motivation to break patterns of behavior that aren't serving them well. Robert and Sarah might discover that they actually enjoy spending time with you once they're not approaching it as an obligation. Or they might go through the motions just long enough to secure their inheritance, then return to avoiding me once the legal requirements are satisfied. Harold nodded, acknowledging the validity of my concern. You're right, there's no guarantee that conditional inheritance would lead to genuine reconciliation, but it would give them the opportunity to prove they value your relationship enough to work for it. I returned to my chair, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about defining what kind of family we would be going forward, about establishing standards for how we would treat each other, about deciding whether love and loyalty could be taken for granted or had to be earned through consistent actions. Harold, let me ask you something. If your children had done this to you, what would you do? He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him imagining himself in my situation. Honestly, I think I'd be tempted to do exactly what you're considering. The dishonesty would hurt more than the rejection itself. At least if they'd told you directly that they preferred to spend Christmas elsewhere, you could have respected their honesty even if you disagreed with their choice. Exactly. They didn't just decide not to come for Christmas. They decided I couldn't handle the truth about their feelings. They treated me like a child who needed to be protected from reality, rather than an adult who deserved honest communication. So what's your final decision? Do you want to disinherit them completely, create conditional requirements, or take more time to consider your options? I took a deep breath, feeling the finality of the moment settling around me. I want to disinherit them completely. If they want to be released from their obligations to me, then I'll release them from any benefits that come with being my children. Michael will inherit everything, and Robert and Sarah will learn that choices have consequences. Harold began pulling forms from his filing cabinet, his movements efficient and professional, despite the gravity of what we were discussing. I'll need to ask you some specific questions about your assets and how you want them distributed. We'll also need to discuss whether you want this change to take effect immediately or whether you want to inform Robert and Sarah about your decision first. What would be the advantage of telling them in advance? It would give them the opportunity to understand the consequences of their actions and potentially change their behavior. Some people need to face the reality of loss before they can appreciate what they're losing. I thought about Harold's suggestion, imagining the conversation where I would tell Robert and Sarah that their Christmas deception had cost them their inheritance. There was a certain appeal to seeing their faces when they realized the magnitude of their mistake. But there was also the risk that they would try to manipulate the situation, apologizing not out of genuine remorse but out of financial self-interest. No, I don't want to tell them in advance. If they apologize now, I'll never know whether it's because they're truly sorry or because they want to protect their inheritance. I want to see how they behave when they think their financial future is secure, regardless of how they treat me. That's actually quite wise. It will give you the opportunity to observe their authentic behavior without the complication of financial motivation. Over the next 2 hours, Harold and I worked through the details of restructuring my will. Frank and I had accumulated more assets than I'd really thought about in concrete terms. The house was worth significantly more than we'd paid for it 47 years ago, thanks to Maple Ridge's growing popularity with young families seeking small-town charm within commuting distance of larger cities. Our retirement investments had grown steadily over the decades, and Frank's life insurance had provided a substantial cushion that I'd barely touched in the 5 years since his death. There were also the family heirlooms that carried value beyond their monetary worth. My grandmother's china, which had graced our Christmas table for decades, would go to Michael rather than being passed down to Sarah, as I'd always planned. The jewelry that had been in Frank's family for generations, including his grandmother's engagement ring that I'd always intended for Tyler to give to his future wife, would now go to Michael to distribute as he saw fit. Most significantly, the house itself would belong to Michael, along with all the memories and traditions it represented. Robert and Sarah had made it clear that those traditions were burdens rather than blessings. Michael would inherit a house where family traditions were valued, where Christmas was celebrated with joy rather than endured as an obligation. As Harold prepared the final documents for my signature, he made one last attempt to ensure I was certain about my decision. Liza, once you sign these papers, there's no easy way to undo this change. Are you absolutely sure this is what you want? I thought about Frank, about what he would say if he could see our family falling apart like this. Frank had always been the peacemaker, the one who found ways to bridge differences and maintain harmony. But Frank had also been a man of principle, someone who believed that respect and honesty were the foundations of any meaningful relationship. Harold, Frank and I spent 47 years building something we hoped would last beyond our own lives. We created traditions, accumulated resources, and tried to model the kind of family relationships we wanted our children to maintain with each other and with their own children someday. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight in my hand. Robert and Sarah have decided that what we built isn't worth preserving. They've chosen deception over honesty, convenience over commitment. I can't force them to value what Frank and I created, but I can ensure that what we built goes to someone who does value it. With that, I signed the new will, officially disinheriting 2 of my 3 children and fundamentally altering the future of our family. The pen strokes felt decisive, final, like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. As I left Harold's office, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The sadness was obvious: grief for the family relationships I'd thought we had, mourning for the trust that had been broken, sorrow for the grandchildren who would be affected by their parents' choices. But the relief was real too. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life, some say in how I would be treated by the people I'd devoted my life to loving. The rest of December passed in a strange, suspended state. I continued my Christmas preparations mechanically, wrapping gifts for children who wouldn't be there to receive them, addressing cards to neighbors and friends who still valued the relationships in their lives. Michael called every few days to check on me and to update me on his attempts to convince Robert and Sarah to reconsider their decision. According to Michael, Robert was sticking to his story about Emma's parents, but he was becoming defensive when pressed for details. Sarah had apparently hung up on Michael when he suggested that she was using the skiing trip as an excuse to avoid coming home. Neither of them seemed to understand that their brother found their behavior as troubling as I did. 3 days before Christmas, Linda invited me to join her family for Christmas dinner, an invitation that was both touching and painful. Linda had been my neighbor for 15 years, and she'd watched my children grow up, seen them come home for holidays, celebrated their achievements and milestones alongside me. The fact that she felt compelled to invite me to Christmas dinner because my own children had abandoned me was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Linda, that's incredibly generous of you, but Michael is still planning to come home. We'll manage just fine with the 2 of us. Are you sure, Liza? You know you're always welcome at our table. It seems wrong for you to be spending Christmas with just one of your children when you raised 3 of them to adulthood. Her concern was genuine, but it highlighted the public nature of my family's dysfunction. In a town the size of Maple Ridge, everyone would notice when Robert and Sarah failed to appear for Christmas. There would be questions, speculation, and eventually the truth would come out. The woman who had been known for her close family relationships would become the woman whose children couldn't be bothered to come home for Christmas. I appreciate the offer, truly. But I think Michael and I will have a lovely Christmas together. Sometimes smaller celebrations are more meaningful than large ones. The words sounded hollow even to me, but I wasn't ready to discuss my family's problems with the neighbors, no matter how well-intentioned their concern. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, with the kind of crisp winter sunlight that made everything look like a Christmas card. I spent the morning in church, sitting in the same pew where Frank and I had worshipped for decades, surrounded by families preparing to celebrate the holiday together. The familiar carols and readings provided some comfort, reminding me that Christmas was about more than family gatherings, that the holiday's true meaning transcended the disappointments of human relationships. Michael arrived in the early afternoon, carrying grocery bags filled with ingredients for the elaborate meal he'd promised to prepare. His presence immediately lifted my spirits. Unlike his siblings, Michael had always been comfortable in the family home, moving through the kitchen and living spaces with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. "Mom, I stopped by the store and got everything we need for tomorrow's dinner. I know it won't be the same without everyone here, but I'm determined to make it special. We're going to have the best Christmas dinner this house has ever seen." His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in weeks I felt genuinely excited about Christmas. "What can I do to help?" "You know I don't like being a guest in my own kitchen. Actually, I was hoping you'd make your famous apple stuffing. I've tried to recreate it at the restaurant, but it never tastes quite right. I think there's some secret ingredient you've never told me about." I laughed, feeling more like myself than I had since this whole crisis began. "The secret ingredient is love, sweetheart. And maybe a little more sage than the recipe calls for." We spent the afternoon cooking together, sharing stories and memories while we prepared food for our dramatically smaller Christmas celebration. Michael told me about his work at the restaurant, his hopes of opening his own place someday, his recent breakup with a girlfriend who didn't understand his commitment to family relationships. She said I was too close to my family, that healthy adults don't call their mothers twice a week, or come home for every holiday. I told her that was exactly the kind of attitude that destroys families, and that if she couldn't understand the importance of maintaining close relationships with people you love, then maybe we weren't compatible. His words reminded me why I'd chosen to leave everything to Michael. He understood something that Robert and Sarah seemed to have forgotten, that family relationships require ongoing investment. That love isn't something you can take for granted, but something you have to nurture through consistent attention and care. "I'm proud of you for standing up for your values," I told him. "Too many people are willing to sacrifice family relationships for convenience, or to avoid conflict with people who don't share their priorities." As evening fell, we attended Christmas Eve service together, sitting in the same pew where Frank and I had celebrated countless Christmas Eves. The church was full of families, children squirming in their best clothes, parents trying to maintain order, while also experiencing the magic of the season through their children's eyes. Looking around at all those intact families, I felt the full weight of what Robert and Sarah had chosen to throw away. They were missing this moment, this connection to something larger than themselves, this opportunity to model faith and family commitment for their own children. After church, we came home to hot chocolate and the quiet ritual of placing the last ornaments on the tree. Michael had always been the one to place the angel on top, a tradition that dated back to his childhood. As he carefully lifted her into place this year, I realized that some traditions would survive, even if the family configuration had changed. "Mom, can I ask you something that might be difficult to answer?" "Of course, sweetheart. Are you really okay with it just being the two of us for Christmas? I know you've always dreamed of having all your children and grandchildren together for the holidays. Are you disappointed that it's just us?" I considered his question carefully, wanting to give him an honest answer that didn't burden him with responsibility for his siblings' choices. "Michael, a month ago I would have said that Christmas without Robert and Sarah was unimaginable. I've spent so many years planning gatherings that included everyone, trying to create experiences that would bring us closer together." I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, where Christmas lights twinkled in neighbors' windows and snow was beginning to fall. But you know what I've learned? Christmas isn't about the number of people around your table. It's about the quality of the relationships you're celebrating. I'd rather have one child who wants to be here than 3 children who feel obligated to endure my company. Do you think they'll ever understand what they're missing? I honestly don't know. But I've decided that's not my problem to solve. I can't force Robert and Sarah to value our family relationships. All I can do is appreciate the relationships I have with people who do value them. As we prepared for bed that Christmas Eve, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Peace. Not the peace of a perfect family gathering, but the peace that comes from accepting reality and finding ways to create meaning within the constraints of that reality. Tomorrow would bring my first Christmas without Robert and Sarah, but it would also bring the opportunity to celebrate with someone who genuinely wanted to be there. Perhaps that was actually a gift, the chance to discover that Christmas joy didn't depend on having everyone present, but on sharing the holiday with people who understood its true significance. In the morning, I would wake up to Christmas Day knowing that my will had been changed, that Robert and Sarah's choices would have consequences they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, I was simply a mother preparing to celebrate Christmas, with the one child who had chosen to honor the traditions we'd built together over the years. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, with fresh snow covering the ground like a pristine blanket. I woke earlier than usual, partly from excitement, and partly from the strange nervous energy that comes from knowing your life has fundamentally changed, even if the world around you looks exactly the same. The house felt different somehow, lighter maybe, as if the weight of disappointed expectations had been lifted from its walls. Michael was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, wearing the ridiculous Christmas apron I'd given him 3 years ago that read, "Chef Santa," in glittery letters. He was humming carols while he prepared what appeared to be the most elaborate Christmas breakfast I'd ever seen. The counter was covered with ingredients for what looked like eggs Benedict, fresh fruit salad, and homemade cinnamon rolls that were filling the house with their warm, sweet aroma. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he called out cheerfully, not turning around from whatever culinary magic he was creating at the stove. "I hope you're hungry, because I may have gotten a little carried away with breakfast. I wanted today to feel special, even if it's just the 2 of us." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. It smells absolutely wonderful in here. I can't remember the last time someone cooked Christmas breakfast for me." The truth was, for the past 5 years since Frank's death, I'd been the one preparing elaborate holiday meals for everyone else, never really considering that I might enjoy being the one who was cared for, instead of always doing the caring. We ate breakfast in the dining room, using the good china and Frank's grandmother's silver, maintaining the traditions that made Christmas feel sacred rather than ordinary. Michael regaled me with stories from the restaurant, descriptions of difficult customers and culinary experiments that had gone either brilliantly right or spectacularly wrong. His easy conversation filled the spaces where Robert's family discussions and Sarah's updates about her real estate business would normally have been. What struck me most was how relaxed our conversation felt. There was no underlying tension, no sense that he was counting the minutes until he could politely leave, no feeling that he was performing family obligation rather than enjoying family connection. This was what I'd always hoped family gatherings would feel like, natural and comfortable and filled with genuine affection. After breakfast, we moved to the living room for our gift exchange. I'd been dreading this moment, knowing that the carefully wrapped presents under the tree told the story of the family I'd thought I had rather than the family I actually had. There were gifts for Robert, Sarah, and all the grandchildren who wouldn't be there to receive them. The sight of those abandoned packages was like looking at the remnants of a dream that had been slowly dying without my full awareness. "Mom, before we open gifts, I need to tell you something important." I called Robert and Sarah yesterday morning, Christmas Eve. I told them both exactly what I thought of their decision to lie to you about Christmas, and I told them they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of gratitude for Michael's loyalty and anxiety about what their responses might have been. What did they say? Robert got defensive, said I didn't understand the full situation, that you wouldn't appreciate knowing how they really felt about family obligations. He said it was kinder to make excuses than to hurt your feelings with honesty. The irony was breathtaking. Robert thought lying to me was kinder than honesty, as if I were a child who needed to be protected from reality, rather than an adult who had earned the right to know where I stood with my own children. And Sarah? Sarah was worse, honestly. She said that you'd created unrealistic expectations about family relationships, that modern families don't function the way families did in your generation. She said she felt sorry for me because I was still trapped in outdated ideas about obligation and duty. Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. Outdated ideas about obligation and duty? These were the values that had held our family together through Frank's cancer diagnosis, through financial difficulties when the children were young, through all the normal challenges that families face over the course of decades. These weren't outdated ideas, they were timeless principles that required effort and commitment to maintain. What did you tell her? I told her that what she calls outdated I call foundational. I told her that families who don't have obligations to each other aren't really families at all, they're just groups of people who happen to share DNA. And I told her that if she couldn't see the difference between healthy family commitment and unrealistic expectations, then she was going to raise children who treat her exactly the way she's treating you. Michael's words carried a prophetic quality that made me shiver. Tyler, Chloe, and Jessica were indeed learning lessons about family loyalty from their parents' behavior. They were watching their parents lie to their grandmother, avoid family obligations, and prioritize convenience over commitment. What kind of adults would they become if these were the values being modeled for them? How did she respond to that? She hung up on me. But not before telling me that I was just as stuck in the past as you are, and that maybe it was better if the three of us who get it just celebrated holidays together from now on. The casual way Sarah had dismissed half the family was stunning. She'd essentially written off her mother and brother as relics of an outdated way of thinking, people whose values were so different from hers that ongoing relationships weren't worth the effort required to maintain them. I'm sorry they put you in the middle of this situation, I told Michael. You shouldn't have to choose sides between your siblings and your mother. Mom, I didn't choose sides. They chose to abandon their side. All I did was refuse to pretend that their behavior was acceptable. His clarity about the situation was both comforting and heartbreaking. It was reassuring to know that at least one of my children shared my understanding of what family relationships should involve. But it was devastating to realize that the other two had moved so far away from those values that reconciliation might be impossible. We opened our gifts slowly, savoring each moment in a way that wouldn't have been possible with the chaos of 3 families and multiple grandchildren. Michael loved the cooking knives I'd chosen for him, and he'd surprised me with a first-edition cookbook from one of my favorite authors, something he'd found at an antique shop in Cleveland. The thoughtfulness of his gift, the fact that he'd remembered my love of vintage cookbooks and taken the time to find something special, reinforced my conviction that he was the child who truly understood the importance of paying attention to the people you love. But the most meaningful exchange came when Michael handed me an envelope that hadn't been under the tree. "This isn't exactly a Christmas gift," he said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "It's more like a promise, or maybe a commitment." Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter, several pages long, in Michael's careful script. As I read it, I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes. The letter was Michael's pledge to maintain the family traditions that Robert and Sarah had abandoned. He promised to come home for every Christmas, every Easter, every Thanksgiving as long as I was alive to celebrate them. He committed to calling me twice a week, to including me in major decisions about his life, to making sure I never felt abandoned or forgotten. But more than that, the letter outlined his vision for the future of our family traditions. He wrote about wanting to bring his future wife home to meet me before he proposed to her, about hoping to raise children who would grow up knowing their grandmother's stories and values. He described plans to document family recipes, to preserve the photo albums and memory books I'd maintained over the years, to ensure that the legacy Frank and I had built wouldn't die with our generation. "Michael, this is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me. But you don't need to make these kinds of promises. Family relationships shouldn't require written commitments." You're right, they shouldn't. But after seeing how Robert and Sarah have treated you, I realize that sometimes it's important to state your intentions clearly so there's no room for misunderstanding or gradual drift away from what matters. His words revealed a maturity and intentionality that impressed me deeply. He'd learned from his siblings' mistakes, recognizing that good intentions weren't enough to maintain strong family relationships. Those relationships required conscious commitment, ongoing effort, and regular reinforcement of shared values. The rest of Christmas Day unfolded with a peaceful rhythm that felt both familiar and new. We cooked together, Michael teaching me techniques he'd learned at culinary school, while I shared the stories behind family recipes that had been passed down through generations. We looked through photo albums, remembering Christmases past and laughing at pictures of the children in their various awkward phases. What surprised me was how complete the day felt despite the absence of Robert and Sarah's families. I'd been so focused on what was missing that I hadn't fully appreciated what was present. Michael's undivided attention, our unrushed conversations, the ability to enjoy traditions without feeling like I was imposing them on unwilling participants. In the early evening, Linda knocked on our door carrying a plate of her famous Christmas cookies and wearing the slightly anxious expression of someone checking on a friend who might be struggling. "Liza, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to make sure you and Michael were doing all right. I know this Christmas is different from your usual celebrations." Her concern was touching, and I found myself genuinely able to reassure her. "Linda, we've had a wonderful day. Michael is an excellent cook, and it's been lovely having the chance to really talk without the chaos of a large group. Where are Robert and Sarah this year? I don't think I've seen them around the neighborhood." The question I'd been dreading had finally arrived. In a town like Maple Ridge, people noticed when longtime patterns changed. When families who'd always celebrated together suddenly didn't. I could see Michael tensing slightly, ready to protect me from having to explain the situation if I wasn't ready to discuss it publicly. "They had other commitments this year," I said simply. "Emma's parents needed Robert's family, and Sarah's family decided to try skiing in Colorado. Sometimes these things happen." Linda's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation, but she was too polite to press for more details. "Well, I'm glad you and Michael are having a nice time together. Family time is precious, however you arrange it." After Linda left, Michael and I settled in the living room with cups of tea and slices of the Christmas cake I'd made weeks earlier, back when I'd still believed the whole family would be there to enjoy it. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sweetheart. Are you angry with Robert and Sarah, or are you more hurt than angry?" It was a perceptive question, one that required me to examine my own emotional landscape more carefully than I'd been willing to do since discovering their deception. Both, I think. I'm hurt that they don't value our family relationships enough to be honest with me about their feelings. I'm hurt that they think so little of my emotional maturity that they believe I can't handle direct conversation about their preferences. I paused, trying to articulate feelings that were still evolving. "But I'm also angry at the disrespect they've shown, not just to me but to everything your father and I worked to build. We spent decades creating family traditions, modeling commitment and loyalty, teaching them that family relationships are worth investing in, even when they require sacrifice or compromise. And now they're treating those lessons like they were mistakes?" Exactly. They're essentially saying that everything Frank and I taught them about family was wrong, that modern people are too sophisticated to be bothered with obligations to their parents, that convenience and personal preference should trump commitment and loyalty. Michael was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire I'd built in the fireplace, something I rarely did when the house was full of people, but that felt perfect for our intimate Christmas celebration. "Mom, I need to tell you something else. When I was talking to Robert yesterday, he said something that really bothered me. He said that he and Sarah have been discussing your situation, and they think you might be getting too attached to this house, too resistant to making practical changes as you get older." This was new information, and it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. "What kind of practical changes?" He mentioned selling the house and moving to a senior living community. He said they're worried about you living alone in a place this big, about what would happen if you had a medical emergency or couldn't maintain the property. The presumption embedded in Robert's concerns was staggering. They were discussing my living situation, making assessments about my capability and independence, planning my future without including me in the conversation. It was yet another example of them treating me like someone whose autonomy couldn't be trusted, rather than an adult capable of making my own decisions. Did he suggest any specific senior communities? He mentioned a couple of places, but Mom, here's what really bothered me about the conversation. He was talking about your future like it was a problem they needed to solve rather than decisions you needed to make. And he seemed to think that your attachment to this house was sentimental rather than practical, like you were clinging to memories instead of being realistic about your needs. The patronizing attitude behind Robert's comments was infuriating. This house wasn't just a repository of memories, though it certainly held decades of precious moments. It was my home, the place where I felt most comfortable and secure, the foundation of my independence and autonomy. The idea that my children saw my desire to remain here as evidence of impaired judgment, rather than legitimate personal preference, revealed how completely they'd misunderstood my character and capabilities. What else did he say about my situation? He said that you might be becoming too isolated, too dependent on family visits for social interaction. He thinks you need more structured activities, more engagement with people your own age. Again, the assumptions underlying Robert's analysis were insulting. I had plenty of social connections in Maple Ridge, friendships that had developed over decades of community involvement. I volunteered at the library, participated in church activities, and maintained relationships with neighbors and former colleagues. The idea that I was some kind of recluse dependent on my children for social stimulation was both inaccurate and condescending. Michael, it sounds like Robert and Sarah have been having extensive conversations about managing my life without ever including me in those discussions. That's exactly what it sounds like to me too. And it makes me even more convinced that they made the right decision to stay away from Christmas. If that's how they really see you, as someone whose judgment can't be trusted and whose preferences don't matter, then you're better off without them. His words crystallized something that had been forming in my mind throughout the day. This wasn't really about Christmas, and it wasn't even primarily about their lies regarding holiday plans. This was about fundamental differences in how we understood family relationships, personal autonomy, and respect for elders. Robert and Sarah saw me as someone whose life needed to be managed, rather than someone whose choices deserved respect. They viewed my commitment to family traditions as evidence of inflexibility rather than as expressions of values worth preserving. They approached our relationship from a position of superiority, assuming they knew better than I did what was good for me. You know what, Michael? I'm actually grateful that they showed their true attitudes now rather than continuing to pretend respect they don't feel. At least now I know where I stand with them, and I can make decisions based on reality rather than on assumptions about relationships that apparently don't exist. What kind of decisions? I thought about the will I'd signed just days earlier, about the legal changes that would ensure my estate went to someone who valued family relationships rather than to people who saw me as a burden to be managed. Decisions about how I want to spend whatever years I have left, and who I want to spend them with. As Christmas Day drew to a close, Michael and I worked together to clean up from our celebration, packing away the good china and storing the leftover food that would provide us with delicious meals for the next several days. The rhythm of these domestic tasks felt comfortable and companionable, like the natural conclusion to a day well spent. Mom, I want you to know that today has been one of the best Christmases I can remember. I know that might sound strange, given everything that's happened with Robert and Sarah, but there's been something really special about having this time together without any distractions or competing demands. His words echoed my own feelings about the day. Despite the sadness of family division, despite the disappointment of broken traditions, we'd created something meaningful together. We'd proven that family connection didn't require large numbers or complex coordination. Sometimes the most profound relationships were the ones that could flourish in simplicity. I feel the same way, sweetheart. Today has reminded me that quality matters more than quantity, that genuine affection is more valuable than obligatory attendance. As we finished our cleanup, the phone rang. Michael and I looked at each other, both wondering if one of the missing family members might be calling to acknowledge Christmas, or perhaps to offer some kind of explanation for their absence. Michael answered the phone, and I could tell immediately from his expression that it wasn't good news. His side of the conversation consisted mainly of, "I see," and "No, I don't think that's a good idea," and "You'll have to talk to her yourself." When he hung up, his face was grim. "That was Sarah. She's calling from Colorado to check in and see how you're handling Christmas without everyone here." The condescending nature of her call was perfectly consistent with everything else I'd learned about my daughter's attitude toward me. She was checking in to see how I was handling the situation, as if I were a child who might be having trouble coping with disappointment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you were handling Christmas just fine, and that if she wanted to know how you were doing, she should call you directly instead of asking me to report on your emotional state." "Did she say anything else?" "She asked if you seemed upset, or if you'd said anything about their decision not to come home. I told her that wasn't my information to share, and that if she wanted to know what you were thinking, she needed to have that conversation with you herself." Michael's handling of the call impressed me. He'd refused to be drawn into the role of messenger or spy, maintaining appropriate boundaries while still being polite to his sister. His response demonstrated the kind of maturity and wisdom that came from understanding that healthy relationships require direct communication rather than triangulation through third parties. She also said something else that bothered me. She said she hoped you weren't taking their absence too personally, that you would understand they need to create their own family traditions now that they're adults with children of their own. The framing of their abandonment as natural evolution rather than deliberate rejection was particularly galling. Creating new family traditions didn't require destroying existing ones. Adult children could honor their parents while also establishing customs for their own households. The idea that maturity meant discarding family connections rather than finding ways to balance multiple relationships revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what healthy family systems looked like. "I suppose she thinks I should be grateful that she called to check on me?" That was definitely the impression I got. Like she was doing you a favor by taking a few minutes out of her ski vacation to make sure you weren't too devastated by their absence. The phone call crystallized my understanding of how completely Robert and Sarah had redefined our family relationships. They now saw themselves as benevolent adults managing their needy mother's emotions, rather than as children who had responsibilities to maintain meaningful connections with their parent. They'd positioned themselves as the mature parties making difficult but necessary decisions about family dynamics, while casting me as someone whose feelings needed to be carefully managed rather than directly addressed. As we prepared for bed that Christmas night, I felt a clarity about my situation that had been missing for months. The changes I'd made to my will weren't acts of spite or revenge. They were appropriate responses to my children's clearly expressed preferences about family relationships. If Robert and Sarah wanted to be released from obligations to their mother, then they should also be released from the benefits that came with being my children. Michael would inherit everything, because Michael was the only one of my children who still understood that family relationships require ongoing investment, that love needs to be expressed through actions as well as words, that some commitments transcend convenience and personal preference. Tomorrow would bring the first day of a new year in our family's history, a year in which I would no longer waste energy trying to maintain relationships with people who'd made it clear they didn't value those relationships. Instead, I would focus on appreciating the connections I had with people who understood the true meaning of family loyalty. Christmas was over, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in an unexpected cocoon of tranquility. Michael had taken additional time off from the restaurant, and we fell into a comfortable routine that felt both nostalgic and refreshingly new. He cooked elaborate breakfasts while I read the morning paper aloud, a habit Frank and I had maintained for decades. We took long walks through the neighborhood, bundled against the winter cold, discussing everything from current events to memories of his childhood that he was seeing with adult eyes for the first time. What struck me most during those quiet days was how natural it felt to have uninterrupted time with one of my children. For years, family visits had been orchestrated affairs, carefully scheduled around multiple families' competing demands, filled with the subtle negotiations required to keep everyone happy and engaged. Michael's presence required none of that emotional labor. He was simply there, fully present, without any sense that he was counting the hours until he could politely escape. On December 30th, everything changed with a single phone call that would shatter the peaceful bubble we'd created and force our family crisis into the open in ways I'd never anticipated. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when the phone rang. Michael answered it, and I immediately noticed the shift in his tone from casual warmth to careful formality. "Hello, Emma." "No, Mom's fine. Actually, she's had a really nice week." His side of the conversation was punctuated by long silences, and I could see his expression growing more serious with each exchange. "Wait, what do you mean by concerning reports? Who's been reporting what?" Michael's voice had taken on an edge I rarely heard from him, the tone he used when dealing with difficult customers at the restaurant who were being unreasonable or dishonest. I moved closer, trying to understand what was happening without openly eavesdropping, though my growing anxiety made subtlety difficult to maintain. "Emma, I think you need to slow down and explain exactly what you're talking about. What neighbor? What did they supposedly say about Mom's behavior?" The mention of neighbors discussing my behavior sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter weather. In a town like Maple Ridge, gossip could spread faster than wildfire, and once stories started circulating about elderly residents behaving strangely, those stories took on lives of their own. That's completely ridiculous, and frankly, I'm offended that you would even repeat such nonsense. Mom is perfectly fine, completely lucid, and managing her life better than most people half her age. Michael's defense of me was fierce and immediate, but I could tell from his expression that whatever Emma was saying was both persistent and troubling. "No, Emma, I will not keep an eye on the situation, because there is no situation to monitor. What I will do is tell Robert that if he has concerns about Mom, he needs to call her directly instead of sending his wife to fish for information through gossip networks." The call ended abruptly, and Michael stood staring at the phone with an expression of such fury that I felt genuinely alarmed. "Michael, what was that about? What did Emma say about neighbors reporting my behavior?" He turned to face me, and I could see him struggling to decide how much to tell me. "Mom, this is going to upset you, but you need to know what's being said so you can address it if necessary. Just tell me, sweetheart. I'd rather know what I'm dealing with than imagine scenarios that might be worse than reality." According to Emma, someone in the neighborhood called Robert to express concern about your mental state. They supposedly told him that you've been acting strangely since Christmas, that you seem confused or disoriented when neighbors try to talk to you. The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. If anything, I'd been feeling more mentally sharp and emotionally stable than I had in months. The clarity that came from understanding my children's true feelings toward me had lifted a fog of confusion and self-doubt that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Did Emma say who made this report? She claimed she didn't know the specific neighbor, that Robert had mentioned it to her but hadn't provided details. But Mom, here's what really bothers me about this whole thing. Emma was asking very specific questions about your daily routines, about whether you're taking care of the house properly, about whether you've seemed forgetful or confused about anything. The pattern Michael was describing sounded disturbingly systematic, less like concerned relatives following up on a neighbor's casual observation, and more like people gathering information for some specific purpose. What kind of specific questions? She wanted to know if you'd been paying bills on time, if you'd been maintaining the house and yard properly, if you'd shown any signs of forgetting important appointments or obligations. She also asked whether you've been talking about Dad as if he were still alive, or if you've seemed confused about what year it is. The questions Emma had asked were classic indicators that someone might be developing dementia or other cognitive decline. They were also exactly the kinds of concerns that adult children might raise if they were considering pursuing guardianship or conservatorship over an aging parent. "Michael, did Emma specifically mention anything about my living situation, about whether I should consider moving somewhere with more support?" "How did you know to ask that?" His surprise confirmed my growing suspicion about what might really be happening. "Because the questions you're describing aren't random concerns about my well-being. They're the specific criteria that courts consider when determining whether someone is capable of managing their own affairs." Michael sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his face pale with the implications of what I was suggesting. "You think Robert and Sarah are trying to have you declared incompetent?" "I think Robert and Sarah have decided that I'm too attached to this house and too resistant to their suggestions about senior living communities. And I think they may be exploring legal options to override my preferences about my own life. The possibility that my own children might be laying groundwork to strip me of my legal autonomy was so devastating that I felt physically sick. But it would explain so much about their recent behavior, their discussions of my situation, their concerns about my attachment to the family home, their assumption that my preferences were sentimental rather than rational. But Mom, that's insane. You're obviously completely competent. Any court would see that immediately. Michael, competency proceedings don't always depend on obvious reality. They depend on documentation, witness testimony, and the narrative that's presented to the court. If Robert and Sarah can find neighbors who will testify that I seem confused or disoriented, if they can point to my decision to maintain this large house as evidence of poor judgment, if they can frame my emotional response to their Christmas deception as signs of instability, they might be able to build a case. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. Robert's comments about my needing more structured activities and social engagement, Sarah's suggestion that I was becoming too isolated and dependent on family visits, their discussions of my situation without including me, their assumption that my attachment to the house represented impaired judgment rather than legitimate preference. We need to find out who supposedly called Robert with concerns about my behavior. How do we do that? We start by calling Robert directly and asking him to explain exactly what he's heard and from whom. Michael looked uncomfortable with the idea of confronting his brother directly, but he recognized the necessity of getting accurate information about what we were dealing with. Do you want me to make the call? No. I think this conversation needs to come from me. If Robert is exploring legal challenges to my competency, he needs to hear directly from me that I'm aware of what's happening, and that I won't allow myself to be railroaded into decisions I haven't made myself. The phone call to Robert was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had with one of my children. When he answered, his voice carried the careful, patronizing tone that had become familiar since Christmas, the way adults speak to confused elderly relatives who need to be handled delicately. Mom, I'm glad you called. Emma mentioned that she talked to Michael today, and we've been concerned about some things we've been hearing. Robert, I want you to tell me exactly what you've heard, and exactly who told you these things. Michael said that someone in the neighborhood expressed concerns about my mental state, and I want to know the specific details of these supposed observations. The directness of my question seemed to catch him off guard. I could hear him shuffling papers or perhaps consulting notes, as if he needed to refer to documentation to answer my question. Well, it's not just one person, Mom. We've had a couple of different neighbors reach out to express concern about some things they've noticed since Christmas. Which neighbors, Robert? I want names and specific examples of concerning behavior. Mom, I don't think it's productive to get into those kinds of details. The important thing is that people who care about you have noticed changes that worry them. His refusal to provide specifics was telling. Either these neighbors didn't exist, or their concerns were so minor that they wouldn't sound credible if described in detail. Robert, I'm going to ask you directly, and I want an honest answer. Are you and Sarah exploring legal options to challenge my competency, or to gain control over my financial and living decisions? The silence that followed was long enough to confirm my suspicions even before he spoke. Mom, no one wants to take control away from you, but we are concerned about your judgment lately, especially regarding maintaining such a large house at your age. We think you might benefit from some assistance with managing your affairs. Assistance that I haven't asked for and don't want. Sometimes people don't recognize when they need help, Mom. Sometimes family members have to step in to protect someone they love from making decisions that aren't in their best interests. The paternalistic tone in his voice was infuriating. He was speaking to me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to understand my own needs or make my own choices. Robert, let me be very clear about something. I am 73 years old, not 93. I am in excellent physical and mental health. I manage my own finances, maintain my own home, and make my own decisions about my life. The fact that my decisions don't align with your preferences doesn't make them evidence of impaired judgment. Mom, we're just worried about you living alone in such a big house. What if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency? Who would find you? The same thing that could happen to anyone living alone at any age. Robert, your concern would be more touching if it weren't so obviously self-serving. What do you mean by that? I mean that your sudden worry about my safety coincidentally emerged right after I failed to conform to your expectations about Christmas celebrations. I mean that your concerns about my living situation conveniently support your apparent belief that I should sell this house and move somewhere that would be more convenient for you to manage. That's not fair, Mom. We're genuinely concerned about your well-being. If you were genuinely concerned about my well-being, you would have had honest conversations with me about your feelings instead of lying about Christmas plans. If you were genuinely concerned, you would ask me what kind of support I might want rather than assuming you know what's best for me. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that Robert was not going to abandon whatever plans he and Sarah had developed for managing my future. He remained convinced that his concerns were legitimate, and that my resistance to his suggestions was evidence of the very poor judgment he was worried about. After I hung up, Michael and I sat in the kitchen trying to process the implications of what we'd learned. The threat to my autonomy was real and immediate, and we needed to develop a strategy for protecting both my legal rights and my reputation in the community. Mom, I think we need to talk to Mr. Patterson again. If Robert and Sarah are really exploring guardianship proceedings, you need legal protection before they can file any paperwork. You're right. But first, I want to find out exactly what's being said about me in the neighborhood. If there really are neighbors spreading stories about my mental state, I need to address those directly. Over the next 2 days, Michael and I conducted what could only be described as a door-to-door investigation of my own reputation. We visited every neighbor within a 3-block radius, explaining that we'd heard there were concerns about my well-being, and asking directly whether anyone had observed behavior that worried them. The results were both reassuring and disturbing. Not a single neighbor we spoke to had any concerns about my mental state or behavior. Several people commented that I seemed happier and more energetic than I had in months. Linda, my closest neighbor, was particularly emphatic in her defense of my mental sharpness and independence. Liza, whoever told your son that you seemed confused must be thinking of someone else entirely. You're as sharp as you've ever been, and frankly, you seem more like your old self than you have since Frank died. But we also discovered something troubling. 3 different neighbors mentioned receiving phone calls from someone claiming to be conducting a survey about elderly residents in the neighborhood. The caller had asked specific questions about whether they'd noticed any older residents who seemed to be struggling with daily activities, showing signs of confusion, or living in homes that appeared to be too much for them to maintain. The survey calls had been skillfully designed to plant seeds of concern while appearing to gather general information about neighborhood demographics. Anyone who participated in the survey would now be primed to notice and report signs of decline in elderly neighbors, even if those signs were ambiguous or minimal. Mom, someone is orchestrating a campaign to create the appearance of community concern about your competency. This isn't random gossip or coincidental observations. This is systematic and deliberate. The realization that my own children were actively working to undermine my reputation and independence was devastating in ways I couldn't have imagined. This went beyond lying about Christmas plans or avoiding family obligations. This was an attack on my fundamental right to control my own life. Michael, I need you to call Mr. Patterson and schedule an emergency appointment. We need legal advice about how to protect myself from guardianship proceedings, and we need it immediately. What are you going to do in the meantime? I'm going to document everything. Every conversation, every neighbor contact, every phone call. If Robert and Sarah want to challenge my competency, they're going to discover that I'm far more prepared for that fight than they anticipated. As we prepared for what was clearly going to be a legal and emotional battle, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the Christmas crisis that had revealed my children's true feelings about our family relationships. If they had continued their gradual distancing without the dramatic deception about holiday plans, I might never have recognized the threat to my autonomy until it was too late to defend against it. Now, at least, I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I could fight back with full knowledge of my opponent's intentions and tactics. The war for my independence was just beginning, but I had no intention of surrendering without a fight. 6 months later, I stood in Harold Patterson's office once again, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Spread across his mahogany desk were legal documents that told the story of a battle won and a family permanently transformed. The guardianship petition that Robert and Sarah had filed in February had been not only dismissed but had backfired in ways they never could have anticipated. Their carefully orchestrated campaign to paint me as mentally incompetent had crumbled under scrutiny. The fake survey calls were traced back to a private investigator Sarah had hired, a discovery that led to sanctions against both her and her attorney. The neighbors they'd hoped to use as witnesses had instead testified about their deceptive tactics and my obvious mental competency. Most damaging of all, the court had been presented with evidence of their Christmas deception and subsequent lies, painting a picture of adult children more interested in controlling their mother's assets than protecting her well-being. Harold looked up from the final paperwork with a satisfied expression. "Liza, I've been practicing law for 50 years, and I've rarely seen a case where the plaintiffs so thoroughly destroyed their own credibility." The judge's final ruling was quite explicit about their motivations and methods. I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Winning this battle had required exposing the depths of my children's deception and manipulation to public scrutiny. The court records would forever document their willingness to destroy my reputation and independence for their own convenience. What happens now with the restraining order? Robert and Sarah are prohibited from initiating any further legal proceedings against you without court approval. They cannot contact private investigators to gather information about you, cannot make false reports to authorities about your mental state, and cannot attempt to interfere with your financial or medical decisions. The legal protections were comprehensive, but they couldn't repair the emotional damage that had been done. The children I'd raised, loved, and sacrificed for had revealed themselves to be people I barely recognized. Their willingness to systematically destroy my autonomy had shown a callousness that went beyond mere disagreement about family obligations. Have they attempted any contact since the ruling? Their attorney reached out last week asking if you might be willing to consider mediation, but I told them that any communication would need to go through me first, as you requested. I thought about their belated interest in mediation. Now that their legal strategy had failed, and they faced potential financial consequences for their actions, they suddenly wanted to negotiate, but their timing revealed everything about their motivations. They weren't seeking reconciliation because they'd recognized the harm they'd caused. They were seeking damage control because they'd realized the price of their behavior. I'm not interested in mediation at this point. They had months to approach this honestly, and they chose deception and legal manipulation instead. Harold gathered the documents into a neat stack. There's one more matter we need to discuss. The will changes you made at Christmas have remained in effect throughout this entire ordeal. Do you want to reconsider those decisions now that the immediate threat has passed? I'd thought about this question frequently over the past months. Robert and Sarah's actions had confirmed every instinct that had led me to disinherit them originally. Their willingness to pursue guardianship proceedings proved that they viewed me as an obstacle to their inheritance, rather than as a mother deserving of respect and autonomy. No changes to the will. If anything, recent events have reinforced my conviction that Michael is the only one of my children who understands what family loyalty actually means. During the darkest moments of the legal proceedings, when Robert and Sarah were painting me as a confused and potentially dangerous elderly woman, Michael had been my unwavering advocate. He'd taken additional time off work to accompany me to court hearings, helped me organize documentation of their deceptive tactics, and never wavered in his support despite pressure from his siblings to convince me to drop my opposition to their petition. The drive home from Harold's office took me through the heart of Maple Ridge, past the elementary school where I'd worked for 3 decades, past the church where Frank and I had been married, past the houses where neighbors had rallied to support me when my own children had tried to destroy my reputation. The community that Robert and Sarah had attempted to turn against me had instead become my greatest source of strength. Linda was waiting on my front porch when I arrived home, holding a bottle of champagne and wearing a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. I heard the news from Harold's secretary. We're celebrating tonight whether you want to or not. Her friendship had been one of the unexpected gifts of this entire ordeal. When she'd learned about the guardianship petition, Linda had organized a neighborhood response that was both touching and fierce. 17 neighbors had written letters to the court attesting to my mental competency and independence. The Homeowners Association had passed a resolution condemning the false survey calls. The library board had issued a statement about my decades of volunteer service and obvious mental sharpness. Linda, you've done more than enough celebrating for both of us over the past months. I'm just grateful it's finally over. Nonsense. We're toasting your victory. And we're toasting the fact that your own son chose family loyalty over his siblings' scheming. Michael's coming for dinner too, along with his new girlfriend. You'll like her, she's got backbone. The mention of Michael's girlfriend reminded me that life was moving forward in positive directions as well as closing difficult chapters. Catherine was a nurse practitioner who shared Michael's values about family commitment and understood the importance of maintaining close relationships across generations. She'd been quietly supportive throughout our legal ordeal, never inserting herself inappropriately but making it clear that she stood with Michael in supporting me. That evening, as we shared dinner around the table where so many family celebrations had taken place, I reflected on how differently this room felt compared to the Christmas morning, when everything had started to unravel. The atmosphere was relaxed, genuine, filled with people who had chosen to be there rather than feeling obligated to attend. Michael raised his glass of champagne to Mom, for showing us all what real strength looks like, and for proving that family bonds can survive even the worst betrayals when they're built on genuine love rather than mere obligation. Catherine added her own toast. To the kind of mother who raises children with integrity, and to the wisdom to recognize which of those children actually learned the lessons she taught. As we drank our champagne and shared stories about the past months, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Frank's death. A sense of family that was chosen rather than assumed, based on mutual respect rather than biological accident, sustained by people who had proven their loyalty through difficult circumstances rather than simply inherited it through genetics. The phone rang during dessert, and Michael answered it with the protective instinct that had become second nature over the past months. His expression grew serious as he listened, and I could tell immediately that the call was about Robert or Sarah. Mom, that was Tyler. He's graduating high school next month, and he wants to know if he can come visit you, alone, without his parents. He says he has some things he wants to discuss about family, and about what's been happening. The request surprised me. Tyler was Robert's son, now 18, and preparing for college. Throughout the legal proceedings, Robert and Sarah had kept their children completely isolated from me, preventing any direct communication that might undermine their narrative about my supposed incompetency. What did you tell him? I told him that any grandchild who wants to visit his grandmother is always welcome here, regardless of what his parents might prefer. The possibility of reconnecting with Tyler offered hope for healing relationships with the next generation, even if reconciliation with Robert and Sarah remained impossible. Perhaps the lessons about family loyalty and honest communication could still be passed down, even if they had to skip a generation to find receptive ground. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd stood on Christmas Eve, looking out at the quiet street where my neighbors had proven more loyal than my own children. But this time, instead of feeling abandoned and betrayed, I felt surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with me when standing was difficult. Michael lingered after Catherine and Linda had gone, helping me clean up from dinner in the comfortable silence of people who understood each other completely. Mom, do you ever regret changing your will? Do you ever wish things could go back to the way they were before Christmas? I considered his question carefully, thinking about the family I'd thought I had versus the family I'd actually had. No, sweetheart. I regret that Robert and Sarah revealed who they really were, but I don't regret learning the truth about our relationships. I'd rather live with honest disappointment than false hopes. And you're not sad about losing them permanently? I'm sad about losing the people I thought they were, but the people they actually turned out to be? Those people were never really mine to lose. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. Christmas morning had begun with the devastating discovery that my children valued convenience over honesty, comfort over commitment. It had ended with me changing my will to reflect the reality of our relationships rather than my fantasies about them. The months that followed had brought a legal battle that revealed depths of manipulation and callousness I couldn't have imagined. But they had also brought clarity about who deserved my trust, my resources, and my ongoing investment of love and energy. Tomorrow, Tyler would call to arrange his visit, and we would begin the work of building relationships with grandchildren whose parents had tried to keep them away from me. Michael and Catherine would continue planning their future together, a future that included maintaining the family traditions that Robert and Sarah had found so burdensome. Most importantly, I would wake up in my own home, surrounded by my own possessions, making my own decisions about my own life. The independence that Robert and Sarah had tried to steal through legal manipulation remained intact, protected by laws they hadn't understood, and strengthened by community support they hadn't anticipated. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I passed the Christmas tree ornaments I'd stored carefully in the closet, waiting for next December's celebration. This time, I knew exactly who would be gathering around that tree, exactly who valued the traditions those ornaments represented, exactly who understood that family love requires effort, honesty, and genuine commitment to endure. Some families survive betrayal and emerge stronger. Others reveal themselves to have been built on foundations too weak to withstand the truth about their members' character. I'd learned which kind of family I'd actually raised, and I'd made my peace with that knowledge. The inheritance I'd changed at midnight on Christmas Eve had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. It ensured that everything Frank and I had built would go to someone who understood its value, someone who would honor the legacy we'd tried to create, rather than treat it as an entitlement to be claimed without effort or earned without respect. Justice, I'd discovered, sometimes required the courage to acknowledge painful truths and act on them, even when those truths involved the people you'd loved most deeply. But once you found that courage, peace followed close behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.